On a scorching summer morning in 1989, beneath the relentless Arizona sun, a young woman vanished from a quiet Phoenix neighborhood. Her name was Michelle Renee Morrison, 23 years old, auburn-haired, with a laugh her mother said could light up any room. She left her apartment to meet a friend for breakfast at 7:30 in the morning. She never arrived. Her car was found 3 days later in the parking lot of a shopping center 15 miles away, keys still in the ignition, her purse tucked beneath the driver's seat. Everything exactly where it should be except for Michelle herself. For 33 years her family waited. They mourned without closure. They buried an empty casket. They celebrated birthdays for a daughter who never came home. And then, in the spring of 2022, a detective with a cold case unit opened a storage box containing evidence that had sat untouched for decades, and everything changed. The arrest that followed WOULD Chinese letter, SHOCK, a community that had long since moved on, would tear open old wounds that had never properly healed, and would prove that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, eventually claw their way back to the surface. How does a person vanish in broad daylight from a city of nearly 1 million people? And how does the truth stay hidden for more than 3 decades? Phoenix in 1989 sprawled across the Valley of the Sun like an organism constantly reaching outward, swallowing desert and farmland in its endless expansion. The summers arrived early and stayed late, turning the valley into a furnace where temperatures routinely climbed past 110 degrees by mid-afternoon. The neighborhood where Michelle Morrison lived sat on the eastern edge of the city, where newer apartment complexes bordered older residential streets lined with palm trees and citrus groves. It was the kind of area where young professionals rented one-bedroom units with swimming pools, where retirees walked their dogs in the early morning before the heat became unbearable, where children rode bicycles in tight circles in cul-de-sacs, while their parents watered lawns that struggled against the desert climate. Michelle had moved to Phoenix 18 months earlier from Flagstaff, where she had attended Northern Arizona University and earned a degree in elementary education. She was working as a substitute teacher in the Scottsdale Unified School District while applying for full-time positions. Those who knew her described a young woman who was organized, punctual, and responsible to a fault. She kept a detailed planner where she recorded every appointment, every obligation, every social engagement in neat blue ink. Her apartment was tidy, her bills paid on time, her car always clean. She called her parents in Flagstaff every Sunday evening at exactly 6 o'clock. She never missed that call. The morning of June 14, 1989, began like any other morning in the Valley of the Sun. The temperature at sunrise was already 78 degrees, the sky cloudless and pale blue, the air dry and still. Michelle's neighbor in the adjacent apartment, a woman named Dorothy Pacheco who worked as a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital, later told investigators that she saw Michelle leave her apartment at approximately 7:25 that morning. Dorothy was watering the petunias in the clay pots on her patio. She waved. Michelle waved back, called out something about the heat, smiled, and walked to her car, a light blue 1986 Honda Accord that she had purchased used 6 months earlier. She was wearing white shorts and a yellow tank top, Dorothy remembered, and she was carrying a small brown purse over her shoulder. Michelle was supposed to meet her friend Jennifer Caldwell at a restaurant called the Egg House on Camelback Road at 7:45. Jennifer, who worked as a dental hygienist, had known Michelle since their freshman year of college. They tried to have breakfast together at least twice a month, usually on Wednesday mornings when Jennifer's shift didn't start until 9:30. Jennifer arrived at the restaurant at 7:40, ordered coffee, and waited. She waited until 8:15. She called Michelle's apartment from the payphone near the restrooms. No answer. She paid for her coffee and drove to Michelle's apartment complex, assuming perhaps that Michelle had overslept, though that would have been completely unlike her. Jennifer knocked on the door of apartment 214. No answer. The parking space where Michelle always parked her Honda was empty. Clear's throat, Jennifer went to work, called Michelle's apartment twice more during her lunch break, left messages on the answering machine. By that evening, when Michelle still hadn't returned any of her calls, Jennifer telephoned Michelle's parents in Flagstaff. Richard and Carolyn Morrison listened to Jennifer's concerns and felt the first cold finger of worry trace down their spines. Their daughter never missed appointments. Their daughter always returned phone calls. Their daughter was supposed to call them on Sunday evening, just 3 days away, and she never, ever missed that call. Richard Morrison telephoned the Phoenix Police Department at 8:30 that evening. The officer who took his call explained that adults were not considered missing until they had been gone for at least 48 hours. Michelle was 23 years old. She had the right to come and go as she pleased. Perhaps she had decided to take a spontaneous trip. Perhaps she was upset about something and needed space. Perhaps there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Richard Morrison insisted that his daughter would never simply leave without telling anyone. The officer took down the information, promised to file a report, suggested that they wait and see if she turned up. She did not turn up. On June 16th, 72 hours after Michelle was last seen leaving her apartment, her light blue Honda Accord was discovered in the parking lot of the Metro Center Mall, a sprawling shopping complex on the northwest side of Phoenix, approximately 15 miles from Michelle's apartment. A security guard doing his morning rounds noticed that the same vehicle had been parked in the same spot for 3 consecutive days, which violated mall parking policies. He called it in to mall management, who contacted the Phoenix Police Department. The officers who responded ran the plates, found that the vehicle was registered to Michelle Renee Morrison, found that a missing person report had been filed just the day before. The car was unlocked, the keys were in the ignition. Michelle's brown purse was tucked beneath the driver's seat, containing her wallet with $63 in cash, her driver's license, 3 credit cards, a checkbook, and a small address book with phone numbers written in her careful handwriting. Nothing appeared to be missing, nothing appeared to be disturbed. The car showed no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage. The gas tank was 3/4 full. The odometer showed that the vehicle had been driven approximately 19 miles since its last service appointment 2 weeks earlier, a distance consistent with Michelle's normal weekly driving. Investigators processed the vehicle thoroughly. They lifted fingerprints from the steering wheel, the door handles, the gear shift, the interior surfaces. Most belonged to Michelle. A few belonged to friends who had ridden in her car. One partial print on the passenger side door handle could not be identified and was entered into the system. They vacuumed the interior and found nothing unusual. Sand, small pebbles, a few dried leaves, the ordinary detritus of desert living. They examined the exterior and found no scratches, no dents, no paint transfer that might suggest a collision or altercation. The car, for all intents and purposes, looked exactly as it should have looked if Michelle had simply parked it and walked away. But Michelle Morrison would never have simply parked her car at a shopping mall 15 miles from her apartment on a Wednesday morning, when she was supposed to be having breakfast with her best friend on the other side of the city. She would never have left her keys in the ignition. She would never have walked away from everything she owned without telling a single person where she was going. The Phoenix Police Department opened a missing person investigation. Detective Walter Simmons, a 17-year veteran of the department who had worked dozens of missing person cases, was assigned as the lead investigator. He began methodically. He interviewed Jennifer Caldwell, who told him everything she knew, which was ultimately very little. He interviewed Dorothy Pacheco, who described seeing Michelle leave that morning looking perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary, perfectly fine. He interviewed Michelle's co-workers at the school district office, who said she had seemed happy, excited about the prospect of landing a full-time teaching position in the fall. He interviewed her ex-boyfriend, a graduate student at Arizona State University named Kevin Chen, who said they had dated for 6 months and broken up amicably 3 months earlier, and that he had not seen or spoken to Michelle since early May. Detective Simmons requested Michelle's phone records. The last call made from her apartment phone was on June 13th at 9:15 in the evening, a 7-minute call to her parents in Flagstaff. The last call received was on June 12th at 6:30 in the evening, a 4-minute call from Jennifer Caldwell confirming their breakfast plans for Wednesday morning. There were no unusual patterns, no calls to or from unknown numbers, nothing that raised any red flags. He drove the route from Michelle's apartment to the egg house on Camelback Road, timing the journey at various hours to account for traffic patterns. At 7:25 in the morning, the drive took approximately 12 minutes. Michelle should have arrived at the restaurant by 7:40 at the latest, which matched Jennifer's timeline. He then drove from Michelle's apartment to the Metro Center Mall on the northwest side of the city. That drive took 38 minutes. There was no logical reason for Michelle to drive in that direction on that morning. The mall was not on the way to the restaurant. It was not on the way to anywhere Michelle needed to be. Clear's throat, Detective Simmons interviewed the mall security guards, asking if any of them remembered seeing a young woman matching Michelle's description on the morning of June 14th. None of them did. The mall had security cameras at the main entrances, but not in the parking lots. The footage from June 14th was reviewed but showed nothing useful, just the usual flow of shoppers and employees coming and going throughout the day. The search expanded. Volunteers from Michelle's church organized search parties. They combed through the desert areas surrounding the mall, looking for any sign of her, any clue about what might have happened. They searched for 3 days, walking grid patterns through the scrub brush and creosote, calling her name until their voices grew hoarse. They found nothing. The Phoenix Police Department brought in search dogs. The dogs picked up Michelle's scent in the parking lot where her car was found, but lost it within 50 feet, suggesting that she had gotten into another vehicle. Richard and Carolyn Morrison drove down from Flagstaff and stayed in Phoenix for 2 weeks, searching, pleading with anyone who would listen, giving interviews to local news stations. Carolyn Morrison appeared on television with tears streaming down her face, begging whoever had taken her daughter to please bring her home. Richard Morrison printed 5,000 flyers with Michelle's photograph and distributed them throughout the city, taping them to telephone poles, placing them on car windshields, handing them out to anyone who would take one. The weeks became months. Summer turned to fall. The investigation continued, but with decreasing intensity as other cases demanded attention and resources. Detective Simmons never stopped working the case entirely, but the leads had dried up, the trail had gone cold, and he had nothing concrete to pursue. Michelle's apartment remained exactly as she had left it until September, when Richard and Carolyn finally accepted that she was not coming back and packed up her belongings. They took everything back to Flagstaff and stored it in their garage, unable to bring themselves to give it away or throw it out. By the end of 1989, the case of Michelle Renee Morrison had joined the ranks of unsolved disappearances, filed away in metal cabinets in the basement of the Phoenix Police Department headquarters, periodically reviewed but never solved. Those who knew Michelle never forgot her. Jennifer Caldwell thought about her every time she drove past the egg house on Camelback Road. Dorothy Pacheco thought about her every time she watered her petunias. Richard and Marcus Morrison thought about her every single day, 3 times a day. When they set the table for dinner and automatically reached for 3 plates before remembering that they only needed 2. Part 2. The investigation. The Phoenix Police Department's missing persons unit operated out of a cramped office on the 3rd floor of the downtown headquarters building, where Detective Walter Simmons kept a corkboard on the wall behind his desk, covered with photographs and notes from his active cases. Michelle Morrison's photograph occupied the center position for months, her face smiling out from what looked like a graduation picture, her auburn hair catching sunlight, her expression optimistic and full of promise. Around her photograph, Simmons had pinned index cards with handwritten notes, a map of Phoenix with 2 locations circled in red marker, copies of witness statements, and a timeline written in his precise capital letters. The investigation in those first months was exhaustive. Simmons had worked missing person cases long enough to know that the first 48 hours were critical, and by the time Michelle's case officially became an investigation, those 48 hours had already passed. He worked backward, reconstructing her life in meticulous detail. He obtained her bank records and found that her last transaction was on June 13th at 4:30 in the afternoon, a $16 purchase at a Safeway grocery store near her apartment. He drove to that Safeway and interviewed the cashiers, showing them Michelle's photograph. One cashier, a high school student named Amanda Torres, remembered her vaguely, said she had seemed normal, had paid in cash, had said thank you and left. Simmons obtained the receipt from the store's records. Michelle had purchased milk, bread, eggs, orange juice, and a package of chicken breasts, ordinary groceries for an ordinary week. He checked her apartment refrigerator, still full of food that had long since spoiled by the time the apartment was processed. The groceries she had purchased were there, most of them untouched. She had cooked dinner that night, it appeared, because there was a frying pan in the sink with traces of chicken and seasoning. The community response to Michelle's disappearance was immediate and overwhelming. Her church, Valley Life Community Church in Tempe, organized prayer vigils and search efforts. More than 200 volunteers turned out on the first Saturday after her car was found, dividing into teams that searched every park, every vacant lot, every drainage canal within a 10-mile radius of the mall. They found nothing. Local television stations ran stories about the missing teacher, showing her photograph during the evening news, broadcasting her parents' tearful pleas. Tips poured into the police department tip line. None of them led anywhere. Those who knew Michelle described her as cautious and aware of her surroundings. She did not hitchhike. She did not go home with strangers. She locked her doors at night. She was not the type of person who would willingly get into a vehicle with someone she did not know and trust. This fact troubled Detective Simmons more than anything else, because it suggested that whoever Michelle had encountered on that Wednesday morning was someone she knew. Someone she trusted enough to approach, someone whose presence would not have alarmed her. He expanded his investigation to include everyone in Michelle's life. He interviewed her coworkers again, this time asking more pointed questions. Had anyone at work expressed unusual interest in Michelle? Had anyone asked her out? Had anyone made her uncomfortable? The answers were all negative. He interviewed her neighbors in the apartment complex more thoroughly. Had they noticed anyone watching Michelle? Had they seen any unfamiliar vehicles in the parking lot? Had they heard anything unusual on the morning she disappeared? The answers again were negative. Dorothy Pacheco, the neighbor who had waved to Michelle that morning, told Simmons that Michelle was friendly but private, that she kept to herself mostly, that she occasionally had friends over on weekends, but never loud parties or late-night gatherings. Clear as throat, Simmons interviewed Kevin Chen, Michelle's ex-boyfriend, for a second time, this interview more formal, conducted at the police station with Chen's attorney present. Chen was a doctoral student in mechanical engineering at Arizona State University, 26 years old, originally from Taiwan. He and Michelle had met at a church social event and dated for 6 months before breaking up in March. Chen explained that the relationship had ended because they wanted different things. Michelle wanted to settle down in Phoenix, establish her teaching career, eventually marry and have children. Chen was planning to return to Taiwan after completing his doctorate to work in his family's manufacturing business. The breakup had been sad but mutual, Chen said, and they had remained on friendly terms. He provided an alibi for the morning of June 14th. He had been in a research lab at the university from 6 in the morning until noon, working on his dissertation. 7 other graduate students and 2 professors could verify his presence. Simmons checked the alibi. It was solid. Chen was eliminated as a suspect. The investigation turned to stranger abduction scenarios. Phoenix in 1989 had its share of violent crime, though most of it was concentrated in specific areas of the city far from where Michelle lived and worked. Simmons reviewed every report of assault, attempted abduction, or suspicious activity in the vicinity of Michelle's apartment and the Metro Center Mall for the 6 months preceding her disappearance. He found 3 reports worth investigating. A woman who reported being followed by a man in a white van near the mall in April, an attempted purse snatching in the mall parking lot in May, and a report of a man exposing himself to female shoppers in the mall in early June. None of these incidents appeared to be related to Michelle's case. The white van had been identified and belonged to a delivery service. The purse snatcher had been arrested. The individual exposing himself had been trespassed from the property, but never identified. Physical evidence remained frustratingly minimal. The forensics team had processed Michelle's car thoroughly and found nothing that pointed to foul play. The unidentified partial fingerprint on the passenger door handle was run through every database available, including the FBI's automated fingerprint identification system. No match. The print was too partial, too smudged to be useful. The interior of the car revealed no fibers, no hair, no bodily fluids that did not belong to Michelle. It was as if she had parked the car, removed her purse and placed it under the seat, left the keys in the ignition, and simply walked away into nothingness. But the location bothered Simmons. The Metro Center Mall was not a place Michelle would have gone on that particular morning. It was in the wrong direction, too far from her appointment, completely illogical. Unless, Simmons theorized, someone had driven her car to that location after she disappeared. Unless whoever took Michelle had needed to dispose of her vehicle and chose the mall because it was large, busy, crowded with cars, a place where an abandoned vehicle might sit unnoticed for days. Which is exactly what had happened. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves in the break room about the case. It had all the hallmarks of an abduction, they agreed, but the lack of witnesses, the lack of physical evidence, the carefully staged vehicle all suggested someone with knowledge of police procedures. Someone who knew how to avoid leaving traces. Some speculated about human trafficking networks operating along Interstate 10, which ran through Phoenix and connected California to Texas. Young women occasionally disappeared along that corridor. Some speculated about a local predator who had been watching Michelle, learning her routine, waiting for an opportunity. But speculation without evidence was merely speculation, and as the months passed without a break in the case, the speculation became quieter and less frequent. By early 1990, the investigation had effectively stalled. Simmons continued to follow up on tips as they came in, but the tips were increasingly far-fetched. Psychics claiming to know where Michelle's body could be found. Conspiracy theorists suggesting elaborate scenarios involving organized crime or government cover-ups. Well-meaning but mistaken individuals who claim to have seen Michelle in California or New Mexico or Texas. None of the tips produced results. The case went cold, as so many cases eventually do, filed away but not forgotten, a folder in a cabinet that grew thicker with reports and thinner with hope. Part 3. The silence time moved forward as it always does, indifferent to grief. The city of Phoenix continued its endless expansion into the desert. New apartment complexes rose where fields had been. New shopping centers opened along the expanding freeway system. The population grew by hundreds of thousands. The case of Michelle Morrison, once front-page news, faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies, more recent disappearances, fresher horrors that demanded attention. Richard and Carolyn Morrison tried to rebuild their lives, though rebuild was perhaps the wrong word because their lives could never be what they had been before. They continued to live in Flagstaff, where Richard worked as an accountant and Carolyn taught piano lessons from their home. Michelle's room remained exactly as she had left it when she moved to Phoenix, her childhood bed still covered with the same floral quilt. Her high school swimming trophies still displayed on the dresser, her books still arranged alphabetically on the shelves. Carolyn dusted that room every week, changed the sheets every month, kept everything perfect for a daughter who would never return. They held a memorial service in November of 1990, though memorial felt inadequate because there was no body to memorialize, no remains to inter. The service was held at their church in Flagstaff, attended by family members, friends, Michelle's former classmates and teachers. The pastor spoke about faith in the face of uncertainty, about trusting in divine plans that humans could not comprehend. Richard Morrison sat in the front pew with his arm around his wife's shoulders, while she wept silently into a handkerchief. After the service, they buried an empty casket in a cemetery on the northern edge of town. The headstone read, Michelle Renee Morrison, 1966-1989, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. But even memorializing did not bring closure, because there were too many unanswered questions, too many possibilities that prevented them from truly accepting that their daughter was gone. What if she had amnesia and was wandering somewhere, unable to remember who she was? What if she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere, waiting for rescue? What if she had been the victim of a crime, but her body simply had not been found yet? These questions haunted them, particularly late at night when sleep would not come and the house was too quiet. Jennifer Caldwell married in 1992, moved to Tucson, started a family. She named her first daughter Michelle. She thought about her missing friend often, wondered what Michelle would have thought of her life choices, wondered what kind of teacher Michelle would have become, wondered if Michelle would have been her son's godmother, as they had joked about years ago when they were still in college, and the future had seemed limitless. Jennifer drove back to Phoenix occasionally to visit family, and every time she did, she found herself driving past the egg house on Camelback Road, now closed and converted into a different restaurant, and remembering that morning when she had sat alone drinking coffee and waiting for someone who would never arrive. Clears throat for those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the cold shadow of suspicion creep into your thoughts despite your best efforts to dismiss it. You understand the particular torment of uncertainty. Dorothy Pacheco, Michelle's former neighbor, moved to California in 1991, but carried with her an image she could not shake. Michelle walking to her car that morning, waving, smiling. So completely ordinary in every way. Dorothy replayed that memory thousands of times, searching for some detail she might have missed, some indication that something was wrong, some clue that might have made a difference. She found nothing. It had been an ordinary morning, and that was what made it so terrifying. Detective Walter Simmons retired from the Phoenix Police Department in 2003 after 31 years of service. The case of Michelle Morrison remained unsolved, one of perhaps 24 cases throughout his career that had never been closed. He kept a copy of her file in his home office, reviewing it occasionally, wondering if he had missed something, if there was some avenue of investigation he had failed to pursue. He had done everything by the book, followed every lead, interviewed every possible witness, processed every piece of evidence. Sometimes he knew that was not enough. Sometimes people simply vanished and stayed vanished, and all the dedication and skill in the world could not bring them back. The case file itself grew thin with neglect. New detectives in the missing persons unit would occasionally pull it out, review the contents, shake their heads at the lack of leads, and file it away again. The physical evidence, stored in the police department's evidence facility, sat in boxes on metal shelves, cataloged and preserved but untouched. Michelle's car had been returned to her parents in 1990. They had kept it in their garage for 3 years before finally selling it to a dealership in Flagstaff, unable to bear looking at it any longer. The world changed. Technology evolved. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Database systems expanded and integrated across jurisdictions. The internet connected law enforcement agencies in ways that had been impossible in 1989. And gradually, slowly, the tide began to turn on cold cases. Departments across the country began dedicating resources specifically to unsolved investigations from previous decades, applying new technologies to old evidence, reopening cases that had long been considered dead ends. In 2018, the Phoenix Police Department established a cold case unit staffed by 3 detectives and supported by modern forensic technologies. The unit's mandate was to systematically review every unsolved homicide and missing person case in the department's history, prioritizing cases where evidence still existed and where witnesses might still be alive. They began with the oldest cases first, working chronologically forward through the decades. The case of Michelle Renee Morrison was assigned to Detective Lisa Huang in March of 2022. Huang was 42 years old, a veteran investigator who had worked in the major crimes unit before transferring to the cold case unit. She had a reputation for thoroughness, for refusing to accept easy answers, for following evidence wherever it led no matter how many hours it required. She requested the evidence boxes associated with Michelle's case, 4 cardboard boxes containing photographs, reports, witness statements, and physical evidence collected in 1989. Huang spread everything across a conference table in the cold case unit's office and began reading. She read every report, every witness statement, every piece of documentation. She studied the photographs of Michelle's car, the maps of the search areas, the timeline Detective Simmons had constructed. She noted something that Simmons had also noted. The location of Michelle's car made no sense. It was too far, too random, too carefully placed. She began to develop a theory, one that required verification. In April of 2022, Huang submitted several pieces of evidence for retesting using modern forensic techniques. The unidentified partial fingerprint from the car door was scanned into updated databases. The interior of Michelle's purse, stored in an evidence bag for 33 years, was swabbed for trace DNA using techniques that had not existed in 1989. A small stain on the driver's seat fabric, never tested because it had not appeared to be blood, was analyzed using modern spectrometry. The results came back in May. The fingerprint still produced no matches. But the DNA swabs from inside Michelle's purse revealed genetic material from an unknown male contributor, material that had been deposited on the leather interior of the purse, likely from handling. The stain on the driver's seat was indeed blood, human blood, type O positive, which matched Michelle's blood type. But there was something else. Mixed with Michelle's blood was a secondary contributor, also human, also type O positive male. Huang ran the DNA profiles through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contained genetic profiles from convicted criminals across the country. No matches. She ran the profiles through genealogical databases, a newer technique that had been used successfully in several high-profile cold cases. No immediate matches, but the database generated a list of possible distant relatives who shared genetic markers with the unknown male contributor. For those who have worked in law enforcement long enough, you learn to recognize the moment when a cold case begins to warm. It is a subtle shift, a convergence of small details that suddenly align in unexpected ways. Detective Huang felt that shift in late May when the genealogical database results came back, with a list of 14 possible relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. She began the painstaking process of building family trees, tracking down descendants, eliminating false leads. By early June, she had narrowed the possibilities to a single family line, one that eventually led to a man named Robert James Keller, who had lived in Phoenix in 1989. Part 4. The revelation: Robert James Keller was 68 years old in the summer of 2022, living in a modest ranch-style home in Mesa, a suburb of Phoenix, approximately 20 miles from where Michelle Morrison had disappeared 3 decades earlier. He had worked for most of his adult life as a mechanic at various auto repair shops throughout the valley. He had been married twice, divorced twice, had 3 adult children from his first marriage who had minimal contact with him. He had no criminal record beyond a single arrest for driving under the influence in 1993, for which he had received probation and mandatory counseling. Detective Huang began investigating Robert Keller carefully, methodically, aware that genealogical DNA matches could sometimes produce false positives. Aware that she needed more than genetic coincidence before approaching a suspect. She obtained Keller's employment records from 1989. In June of that year, he had been working at a transmission shop on Indian School Road in Phoenix, not far from the Metro Center Mall. She obtained his vehicle registration records from 1989. He had owned a white Ford pickup truck. She began searching through old reports, looking for any mention of white pickup trucks in the area where Michelle had disappeared or near the mall. She found nothing specific, but the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. Huang interviewed former employees of the transmission shop where Keller had worked. Most of them had moved on, retired, or lost touch with that period of their lives. But one former coworker, a man named Thomas Chen who now lived in California, remembered Robert Keller vividly. Keller had been a loner, Chen said, kept to himself mostly, rarely socialized with other employees. Chen remembered something else. Keller had taken several days off in mid-June of 1989, called in sick, unusual for someone who rarely missed work. The dates lined up with Michelle's disappearance. In July of 2022, Detective Huang obtained a court order to collect a DNA sample from Robert Keller for comparison with the unknown male DNA found in Michelle's purse and mixed with her blood on the car seat. On July 19th, 2 detectives approached Keller outside his home as he was leaving for work early in the morning. They explained who they were, showed him the court order, asked him to accompany them to the station for questioning. Keller agreed without resistance, seemed almost relieved. One detective later noted in his report. Clears throat at the Phoenix Police Department headquarters, in an interview room painted pale green with a table bolted to the floor. Robert Keller sat across from Detective Huang and Detective Marcus Torres. They read him his rights. He acknowledged understanding them. They collected a buccal swab from inside his cheek for DNA comparison, and then they began to ask questions. The interview lasted 6 hours. Robert Keller spoke slowly, methodically, occasionally pausing for long stretches of silence before answering. He said he remembered the case of Michelle Morrison, had seen the news reports at the time, had wondered what happened to her like everyone else in the city. Huang asked him if he had ever met Michelle. Keller said he did not remember meeting her, but it was possible, he supposed, that their paths had crossed somewhere. Phoenix was a big city, but the world was small. Huang asked him if he could explain how his DNA might have ended up inside Michelle's purse. Keller said he could not explain that. Perhaps there had been some mistake in the laboratory. Perhaps the DNA had been contaminated. Huang then presented evidence that the detectives had gathered. His proximity to the locations involved, his unexplained absence from work during the crucial days. The DNA match that the laboratory had confirmed with 99.9% certainty. She explained that the burden of proof now rested on him, to provide an alternative explanation for how his genetic material had ended up mixed with Michelle Morrison's blood inside her vehicle. Robert Keller sat silently for nearly 10 minutes. The detectives waited, and then, slowly, carefully, he began to speak. He said, "I did not mean for her to disappear. I did not plan for any of this to happen. It was an accident, all of it." He described an encounter on the morning of June 14, 1989. He had been driving to work, running late, had stopped for gas at a station on Camelback Road not far from Michelle's apartment. He had seen her in the parking lot of the station, standing beside her Honda looking distressed. Her car had overheated, the temperature gauge was in the red, steam was rising from beneath the hood. He had approached her, offered to help. She had been grateful, relieved. He had looked at the engine, diagnosed a broken radiator hose, told her the car was not safe to drive. She had asked if he could give her a ride to the restaurant where she was supposed to meet her friend. He had agreed. She had gotten into his truck, but he had not taken her to the restaurant. He had driven in a different direction, he said, had driven toward the desert. She had become frightened, had asked where they were going, had demanded that he stop the truck. He had not stopped. She had tried to open the door while the truck was moving. They had struggled. He had struck her, he admitted, harder than he intended. Her head had hit the dashboard. There had been blood, a lot of blood. She had stopped moving. He had panicked. He had driven into the desert north of the city, had carried her body far from the road, had buried her in a shallow grave in an area where the ground was soft enough to dig with a shovel he kept in the truck bed. He had returned to the gas station, had driven her car to the Metro Center Mall, had wiped down the interior surfaces but had missed some spots, clearly. Had left the keys in the ignition, hoping someone would steal it, and the evidence would disappear. He had returned to work the next day, had tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. Detective Huang asked him if he could direct them to the location where he had buried Michelle Morrison. Keller said he thought he could, though the desert had changed significantly in 33 years, and he was not certain he could find the exact spot. They suspended the interview. Huang contacted the district attorney's office, contacted the crime scene investigation unit, arranged for a search team to be assembled. On July 21, 2022, Robert James Keller was taken into custody and formally charged with the murder of Michelle Renee Morrison. He was transported in a police vehicle, accompanied by detectives and forensic specialists, to an area of desert approximately 40 miles north of Phoenix, where housing developments now encroached on what had once been empty land. He directed them to a location near the base of a small hill covered with saguaro cacti and palo verde trees. The forensic team spent 3 days excavating the site. They found skeletal remains buried approximately 4 feet beneath the surface, remains that were later identified through dental records as belonging to Michelle Renee Morrison. She had been wearing remnants of white shorts and a yellow tank top, exactly as described by her neighbor on the morning she disappeared. Her brown purse was not found. Robert Keller had kept it. He admitted, for reasons he could not explain, had hidden it in his garage for years before eventually throwing it away in the early 2000s. But enough physical evidence remained at the burial site to corroborate Keller's confession. The arrest shocked the community, particularly those who had known Robert Keller, who had worked alongside him, who had lived near him, who had had their vehicles repaired by him over the years. He had seemed like an ordinary person, they said, quiet and unremarkable, someone who would blend into any crowd. He had not seemed capable of the kind of violence that had ended Michelle Morrison's life.